I want to invite everyone to gather around for an unforgettable experience. Prepare to enter a nightmarish world of endless terror. A world of monsters, phantoms, and mysteries from the depths of outer space. Now, this experience won't come from a Friday night horror film or a Saturday afternoon monster movie, but from real-life encounters, which makes it all the more horrifying. I'm Dr. William Lester, and I welcome you to Blackwater Media's Creature Feature Fest. I've heard stories of these upright walking wolf creatures that people are calling dogmen. But I never imagined in my wildest dreams that something like that could really exist. And of course, for that reason, I would never see anything like that. But I was wrong. Man, I was goddamn wrong. It was a Friday night in November, 3 years ago, and it was raining like a motherfucker. I was in the den watching college football on ESPN, as was my habit on such occasions. I was enjoying chicken wings and sipping Crown Royal. The stereo was putting out some Sublime, Coltrane, West Montgomery, so on. You get the idea. Anyway, I was sitting in a recliner, which was on the left side of the room facing the TV. The window was on the other side of the room and 8 to 10 feet further along the wall from my chair. Now, like I said, it had been raining off and on all day, and as night fell, the rain really picked up. Every now and again, my eyes would catch the movement of falling leaves just outside the window. Like I said, it was November, and the leaves had taken on their autumn colors and fell regularly, and even more so in the wind and rain. Anyway, for whatever reason, a very strange feeling started coming over me. I can't really explain it, but it was a weird sensation of unease that at the time I couldn't account for. And then another flash of movement coming from the window caught my eye. And what I saw shocked and horrified me on every level of existence. Standing outside the window, in the darkness and pouring rain, was a huge wolf-like creature. It was just standing there peering in, and it had its right hand on one of the panes of glass. I mean, it actually had hands with fingers. And I mean fingers that ended in sharp claws or nails. From what I could see, it was covered in dark hair that was drenched by rain, and this thing was easily between 7 and 8 feet tall. I could see its breath was fogging up a section of the glass, and I remember just shouting out loud, "Oh shit." I realized that this damn thing could come through that window if it really wanted to. It occurred to me to step out to the hallway closet to get my rifle. And as if this wolf thing could read my thoughts, before I could take a step, it backed away from the window, turned, and dropped all fours and shot off into the darkness and rain. Well, I can tell you, I jumped way down into that bottle of Crown Royal. The next day, I checked the ground outside the window for tracks, but could only find a few faint impressions. The heavy rain must have obscured the other traces. So that's it. That's what happened. Since then, I've read a lot about other people's sightings all over the United States. I've also read and heard a lot about how some people want to go out into the woods and find this creature. Let me tell you something. I have seen this thing, and I strongly advise you not to go out looking for it, not to go out hunting for it under any circumstances. Because if you do, and you find it, I can promise you, you'll regret it. My supervisor radioed me just after sunrise on a warm summer morning in 1929 to report another incident aboard the shipwrecked E.C. Waters out on Charlotte's Island. A bunch of drunks were boozing and brawling on the boat last night, he said, in a grumpy tone that clearly indicated his lack of morning coffee. I sighed. Again, I had no idea why so many summer visitors flocked to the wreck of the old steamboat on Charlotte's Island, which lay partially submerged beside a sandy beach. I want you to head out there and make sure no one got knocked on the head or stranded on the island when the brawl ended, my supervisor continued. Right, boss, I said. I hurried down to the marina and headed out in the boat we used for official business. It was a short ride out to Charlotte's Island. I sighed as I drew closer to the creaky old tub listing precariously on the shore. There were empty beer bottles strewn on the beach and floating in the water, always a sign of trespassers. I moored my craft and gathered up as much trash as I could. Then I cautiously ventured onto the rickety steamboat. Thankfully, I found no bodies huddled asleep in the beer-soaked wreck. Time to check the island. Charlotte's Island was 1.3 miles long, and I was going to have to check the whole damn thing, just in case some of the drunks had gone exploring last night. With a sigh, I headed out in a basic search pattern. By mid-morning, I was hot, grumpy, tired, and convinced I was on a wild goose chase. There had been no sign of stranded vacationers, drunk or sober. I headed back toward the sunlit beach, ready to return to the mainland. As I came over a tiny rise, a huge wind struck me hard, making me stagger backward a few paces in the suddenly freezing air. In front of me, I saw the lake churning in great waves while a huge storm cloud massed overhead. I saw something big and bulky floating at the edge of the water. Something man-shaped. My heart leapt into my throat and I rushed forward. Dear God, someone had fallen from the boat last night and hit his head. My hands felt cold and clammy as I fumbled with the radio at my belt. I had to call this in, but when I spoke into the radio, it only returned static. I dropped to my knees beside the body, noticing that the sodden clothing was old-fashioned, dating from long before 1900. The drowned man looked rather like a fur trapper or explorer from the era when Yellowstone was first discovered. I checked his neck for a pulse. There was no pulse. I turned the body over and stared into a pair of bulging brown eyes on a blue-white face. And then, in between one breath and the next, the body vanished. Suddenly, my hand was gripping empty air instead of an old-fashioned jacket. I reeled backwards with a gasp and landed on my butt in the sand. Where had that corpse gone? I glanced frantically over the calm, sparkling waters of the still lake, searching for the body of the drowned man. The warm summer wind caressed my face as my brain registered the change in scenery. What had happened to the approaching storm? Where were the huge wind-swept swells that had frightened me so much when I came over the rise? I scrambled to my feet and stood, hyperventilating with my head between my legs, arms braced on my knees. This couldn't be happening, but I knew it was. The storm, cold wind, and corpse had vanished in a heartbeat. They had been shades of a former time, a former accident. So that's why the man's clothes had been so old-fashioned. Spooked by the incident, I unmoored the official park boat and left in, glad to get away from Charlotte's Island. Folks said that Lake Yellowstone never gave up its dead. Apparently, neither did the island. I turned my craft and headed back to the mainland, and hopefully, sanity. No more ghosts for me. My family and I were outside in an area near Lufkin, Texas, when the space shuttle Columbia exploded. It shook the ground like an earthquake. And my theory is that the explosion somehow stirred up a creature that we call the man-cat. It ran out of the forest after all the shaking. It was built like a panther. It had tan fur, but the damn thing stood up on two legs and ran off with incredible speed. I remember it had a massive wide head and a super long tail. Later on, we had the game biologist come take a picture of its footprint, and he said he's heard of similar sightings in the Angelina forest. That's not a comforting thought at all. My name is Terry, and I have a short but scary story about my run-in with a dog man. I live in a certain part of Florida that has very deep woods and it's a very swampy location. I don't want to be too specific about the names of places. In fact, I've even changed some of the names for the purposes of this story, because I've learned all too well what can happen when people find out about a dog man encounter. Now, I've had multiple strange occurrences around my property, mostly at night. But I want to tell you about this one particular incident that, to put it mildly, scared the hell out of me. Now, what happened took place in an area called Gibson Creek Campground. I was invited to go hunting with a buddy of mine last winter for wild hogs. You could usually find them out there looking for water or rutting around in the muck. So we left out from Gibson Creek Campground and paddled upstream. Eventually, we made it way out to where we could make another camp. After nightfall, we'd already set out a couple of trail cameras. I'd say we were there till about 2 a.m. And the forest, which is usually quite noisy, was somehow strangely silent. You know, that kind of quiet that you know isn't right? So I turned to my buddy and he turned to me. We gave each other those looks of a little fear and a little confusion. So we humped it back to the tent. I'd say no more than 60 seconds later, we heard what sounded like something huge booking it across the creek over on our side about 10 feet out, and then it just stopped. When we looked out, oh my God, what we saw was a gigantic wolf, maybe 8 feet tall, standing there on the other side of the creek. I heard a deep, low-level growl, and my friend perked up to silently announce that he heard it too. So of course, you can imagine that seeing that creature, realizing that something like that is real, scared the complete and total shit out of both of us. We didn't hear it anymore, and after that, the regular nighttime forest sounds came back. Crickets, owls, all of the things you'd expect. But we didn't leave our tent until daylight. So please, allow me to offer this little advice. If you enjoy camping, that's fine. If you enjoy a jaunt through the woods, great. But when the sun starts to go down, get your ass out of the forest and back to the main camping area and stay there until sunrise. About 20 years ago, I was driving south of an area called Three Rivers, between San Antonio and Corpus Christi, Texas. It was between midnight and 1 a.m. when something monstrous flew over the top of my car. A large, white, humanoid figure with wings. And no, it wasn't a damn crane, or goose, or swan, or any kind of bird of prey, or swamp gas, but a humanoid figure with skin-like wings. Now I remember doing about 65 miles per hour, and it came from the right rear and crossed my driving line at about 45 degrees, overtaking me in speed by maybe 5 to 10 miles per hour. Now as it crossed over me, it was only 10 or so feet above the roof of my car. Its wingspan was probably 12 to 15 feet, and the skin was white. The wings looked to be constructed or shaped more like you'd expect to see in a bat or a pterodactyl, but with clearly defined human-type arms on the leading edge. There were also very definite, very clear-looking human-type legs trailing behind it, and the torso was built like a man. But because it came from behind, I didn't see a face. But looking back on it now, I'm goddamn glad I didn't. I'll never forget it as long as I live. I'm an avid bird watcher. I took up the hobby about 3 years ago, and it's really been one of the most enjoying, fulfilling experiences of my life. I remember when I was little, my grandmother had several bird feeders and baths in her backyard, and I would sit at the window and watch all the different birds fly in and out. Robins, brown thrashers, cardinals, blue jays, as well as many more that I couldn't identify at the time. But it was my love of bird watching, or some people are now calling it birding, that led to an experience that I would never, ever forget. It was about this time last year on an unusually warm January day when I trekked up to Dawson Forest Wildlife Management Area. Dawsonville is north of Atlanta in Dawson County. The location is a large area of varied habitat near the Etowah River. I knew that the marshy wetlands hosted breeding species including common yellowthroat, indigo bunting, blue grosbeak, orchard oriole, so on and so forth. Plus, I was counting on seeing what species could be seen along the edges of the forest. There was a nice blind with a bench overlooking the pond where I could look for waterfowl and waders. So that's exactly where I headed once I got there. I hit the bench, took out my thermos of piping hot coffee, poured a cup, took a few sips, and just kind of took in the surroundings. The morning mist had all but dissipated. I broke out my Athlon Argos binoculars, looked out across the pond, and got the shock of my life. Standing on the far bank of the pond was some kind of large canine-type creature. It reminded me of something in many of the werewolf movies over the last several years. Its ears pointed straight up. It was very tall and had broad, powerful-looking shoulders. Through my binoculars, I could make out its muscle definition, and its eyes had a very deep orange tint to them. The other really strange thing about it was that it seemed to have hands with fingers instead of paws. I was in an absolute vortex of abject fear and wild fascination. Now the creature looked around and then went down on all fours and started drinking, but stopped after only a few seconds. It raised up its nose and I could see its nostrils flaring. Then came a moment of total terror. It must have caught my scent because it locked its eyes dead on me. And I didn't move. But while I kept my binoculars on the creature, my brain was on fire trying to calculate how fast I could get back to the car. Then, as it kept those enormous fiery eyes fixed on me, the creature let out a roar that hit me like a tornado. From that point on, I was in survival instinct mode, and I'm sure that I moved faster that day than I ever had in my life. Shit, I'm not even sure that my feet were touching the ground, and before I knew it, I was slamming the car door shut and starting the engine. I don't even think I exhaled until I hit the on-ramp to the interstate. So that's what happened. I have read a good bit on cryptozoology since then. All kinds of encounters with all kinds of creatures. Chupacabra, Mothman, Bigfoot, lake monsters, and a menagerie of other weird things. And of all things, my first and so far only cryptid experience had to be with a damn dog man. Maybe the very worst of all. If you're enjoying the show, go on over to blackwatermedia.net and join the Swamp Hunter Society. Just click on the Become a Member tab on the menu, and for only $4.99 a month, you can have exclusive access to the finest paranormal, horror, and supernatural story narration content available anywhere. It's the ultimate digital audio exploration into mystery, magic, monsters, and myth. Become a Blackwater Media Swamp Hunter Society member today. My entire childhood, my father and I used to take late-night walks due to his insomnia from working a late shift. Our neighborhood was considered very safe, and ultimately was an urban neighborhood, even though one of the roads towards the back of the neighborhood was lined with thick forest for about a mile and about a quarter deep, which made a circle back on itself. All of these walks are very dear memories of mine except one, and it ended up being the last one. Along the road with the tree line, there was a single street light to illuminate a small plot of land that someone owned, but was very overgrown and ill-kept. It was common for us to walk this road to enjoy the sounds of the forest, the lack of illumination, and the ease of circling back. One ordinary night, as we were walking and making conversation, my father abruptly stopped, pulled me close, put his hand over my mouth, and crouched down with me. He pointed toward a single illuminated plot roughly 100 yards away. At first, I didn't see anything and thought he was pulling my leg, but just as I began to protest his grasp, I saw a very small humanoid figure, roughly 3 feet in height, scrawny with long limbs, and seemed to be wearing some kind of weird overalls or bodysuit. It came out of the plot's brush line and cautiously took in its surrounding before signaling towards the brush. After a few seconds, 2 other small humanoid figures, looking just like the first one, materialized as well. After a few moments of what looked like a discussion, all 3 made a dash for the forest tree line. Once this happened, my father picked me up, threw me over his shoulder, and made a break for our home, which was roughly a half-mile back. Now keep in mind, my father was 6'5" and about 220 pounds, and at the time I was roughly 120 pounds, and he never showed signs of slowing due to his fear and adrenaline. After that night, we never took late-night walks. He installed 4 bright motion detection lights around our acre plot and brought home a dog. The few times I've tried to bring it up, he doesn't want to discuss it and made it clear he never wanted to. I think that night, my father and I encountered alien beings. The image of them standing there huddled together is still very vivid after 15 years, and it frightens me. One weekend, my girlfriend Lisa and I went up to our mother's house up in the Wisconsin woods. She raised chickens and had a beautiful Siberian husky named Jupiter, who was caged every night to keep him safe as there were black bear in the area, coyotes, and a rumored mountain lion. Anyway, they had a motion-activated yard light on their garage which would activate a security alarm in the house. Now, the second night we were there, Jupiter started barking. And then the alarm went off. Now, the motion detector is set to only go off if the motion is at 4 feet or higher. Lisa hopped out of bed and shut off the alarm. We both hurried out to the enclosed porch to look around, and you better believe I had my damn pistol well in hand. Now, about that time, the chickens started acting frightened and upset, and you could hear them going berserk in their coop. Lisa thought that someone was trying to steal a chicken. I made my way around to the coop to unlock the door, and all of a sudden, this huge wolf-like creature on 2 legs came barreling out of the coop with a chicken in its jaws. When it saw me, it dropped to all fours and took off running at a crazy speed. At that point, I ran back into the house in a state of complete disbelief. I locked the door behind me. Lisa was there, just inside, and her mother came tearing down the stairs asking what all the ruckus was about. I described to them exactly what happened and what I'd seen. The biggest goddamn wolf I'd ever seen, easily 1.5 feet taller than me, and I'm 6 feet tall. I mean, I watched this thing go from 2 legs to 4 legs in a matter of seconds and dash off with a chicken in its mouth. It's crazy, too. There was no sign of damage to the coop, inside or out, so the creature had to have removed the latch to the coop door with its hands. Of course, we didn't get much sleep that night. Well, shit, we didn't get any sleep. That's the truth. And yeah, it'll be a while before we head out for another trip out there. It'll be a good long while. Back in 1880, a former slave from a Georgia plantation called Old Sam, his name's been lost to history. It was said that he was starting to do okay for himself. He'd been working about 30 acres of his own for a few years and was looking to buy 10 more. But this was post-Reconstruction era Georgia, and Jim Crow was the social and political reality. Old Sam was falsely accused of stealing chickens and tobacco seed. And worst of all, of talking to a white woman while looking her in the eye. A few nights later, 5 men in robes and burlap hoods kicked in his door and pulled him from his bed at gunpoint. He was whipped on a post, beaten, and kicked to near unconsciousness. It took 5 men to do this. They bound his hands and feet, doused him with lamp oil, and then burned him alive in a hayloft. That was more than 100 years ago. But the ground could not hold his despair and anguish. It could not contain his stolen humanity. And so Old Sam returned just a few weeks later to pay a call to 5 men. Not in vengeance, but to collect a debt and in exacting justice. His ancestors and their gods have very, very long memories. I've been hunting for over 30 years now. My father, grandfather, great uncle, and cousins all taught me the meaning of the ways of the hunter. And not just that, I learned what it meant to be an outdoorsman, to have an understanding, an appreciation, and respect for nature. But none of that experience, None of that understanding or appreciation could have prepared me for an encounter with the dog man. All of it came about one morning with me and my father scouting out a new hunting area. Since we were totally unfamiliar with the area, we thought it prudent to not go unarmed. About 20 minutes in, we found a trail that needed checking out. As soon as we hit it, I caught a flash of movement off to the left side of the trail, about 25 to 30 yards away. I didn't think much of it at first because it's normal, for example, to see the movement of birds flitting back and forth on branches and into the brush and brambles of a thicket. But both my dad and I stopped cold in our tracks when the sound of a low rumbling growl reached our ears. But it was more than that. You could feel the power of the growl vibrating all the way through you down to the bone. Now, I said quietly that we must have walked up on a bear with a cub and the growl was intended to scare us off. But my father just shook his head and said, "We have a situation here." Then the shit got real. From the left side of the trail, out of the brush, stepped a gigantic wolf-like creature that was standing on two legs. The head was easily 3 times bigger than a large German shepherd. It had black fur and dirty yellow eyes. And this thing had a muscle mass like you wouldn't fucking believe. It was easily 7 feet tall and had a mouthful of teeth that looked ready to do business. So there we were, my father and I, caught up in a terrifying showdown with this thing. I raised my pistol and pointed it at the creature, and when I did, it tilted its head to the right. Then my dad said under his breath, "Put that goddamn thing down and take 2 steps back." Then the creature dropped down on all 4 legs and took off to the right at a tremendous speed, and we watched it until it disappeared into the forest. That was about 10 years ago. My father and I have talked about it several times, only with each other, off and on since then. He always reminds me that if I'd pulled the trigger that day, that I probably wouldn't be around today to share this story with you. Dr. Lester, I saw your recent post about the Hat Man. I had an encounter with this being in the late 80s when I was driving tractor trailer. I stopped to get some sleep on the steering wheel of the cab, which, keep in mind, is about 12 feet off the ground. I felt like someone was looking at me, so I lifted my head up off the steering wheel and looked out the driver's side window, and he was staring at me. He couldn't have climbed up the side of my truck. He was wearing an old-fashioned tuxedo and a top hat. He was pure white, except his eyes were pure black. I want to tell you something. The dog man isn't the only canine cryptid roaming the woods, especially here in the northern woods of Michigan. There's another wolf-like creature called a wahila. It's a horrific white wolf the size of a grizzly bear and strength enough to tear a man's head off. My Aunt Alice said that she encountered this creature many, many years ago, long before the main highway came through her town. She said it was a really big wolf, light gray, almost white. But she didn't mention seeing it raising up on its hind legs like dogmen do in many encounters. Now, the Native Americans in the area said that it was the wahila, and that she was lucky to see it and live to tell about it. Based on the natives' legend, Wahilas enjoy killing intruders and ripping the victim's head off as a warning for others not to dare trespass in its territory. I've since read that this creature is also known among the indigenous people of the Pacific Northwest and even the northern territories of Canada. A man named Frank Graves led an expedition in 2018 in search of the Wahila and recalls seeing the animal. He was with a First Nation guide out hunting for food on the top of a bluff. The guide left Frank alone for a moment to get closer to some birds to shoot. While Frank was alone, a large wolf-like beast emerged from the forest towards him. In fear, he unloaded both barrels of his shotgun and hit the creature. But the animal seemed unfazed, but acted like it didn't want to get shot anymore, so it turned around and began walking back into the forest. So, when you factor in Bigfoot, Dogman, and now this goddamn Wahila thing, there's lots and lots of reasons to stay out of the woods. After hearing some of the other creature feature stories, I thought I would share an experience that I had a few years back. I've always enjoyed fishing, and there are a number of ponds and lakes within a 10-mile or so radius of my home. During the summer, it's not unusual for me to go fishing 2 or 3 days a week. It was June of 2017, and I'd gone out to a nice little pond I knew about to catch bluegill. I remember it being a very pleasant day with only a few high, wispy clouds. Well, after about 30 minutes, I heard something rambling in the brush on the other side of the pond. Now, behind the brush, there was a short stretch of woods, maybe an acre or so. I thought maybe a deer was over there rooting around. I decided to walk around to the area to see. I took about 5 steps when this very large black figure rose up out of the brush. This thing was a gigantic wolf standing up on 2 legs. I mean, this goddamn thing was 7 to 8 feet tall, including ears that had to be 8 or 9 inches. It had orangish, yellowish eyes, and it looked dead at me, bearing these huge, sharp-ass teeth with an expression of absolute malice. It let out a low growl, then turned and paced off into the wooded area. Now, right before it got out of my sight, it dropped down to all 4 legs and walked away. Now, like I said, that was June of 2017. I still love fishing, of course, but that particular pond has been permanently scratched off my list. Sometimes in a person's life, there's an experience that is so frightening and traumatic that their entire concept of reality is changed, and so too is their view of their place in the larger order of things. In the mid-60s, my uncle was a deputy sheriff in a small town. Now, I don't want to reveal the location because of all of the self-styled investigators, thrill seekers, and so-called adventurers out there just waiting to pounce. Anyway, he'd locked up a drifter who he'd caught in the process of trying to steal a car. The stranger had been ranting about having to get out of town before nightfall. He was sure that the guy was most likely stoned out of his mind. That night, my uncle was driving back to the station just off his rounds. He noted what a crystal clear night it was, with the stars and an almost orange full moon lighting up the sky. He was only a block from the station when something impossible ran out in front of him. Some kind of creature. It had to be, but he recognized the blue shirt of the drifter. It was torn in 3 places. But the thing, hair covered its face. Its ears were long and pointed, and it flashed a mouth with insanely jagged pointed teeth. It stood there in the middle of the road, snarling, not like an animal, but like a madman, and illuminated by the police car headlights. My uncle jumped out of the car and got off 2 shots at it before it dashed off into the darkness. He was sure that he'd hit it, but it seemed unfazed aside from being jerked by the impact. He found the office in shambles and the cell door bars were bent wide open. He didn't know it at the time, but my uncle had an encounter with a werewolf and lived to tell the tale. When I was about 10 years old, I went on a field trip with my 4th grade class to a summer camp. For the most part, it was a typical experience. Rafting, bad food in the mess hall, hiking, campfires, etc. Hell, one of my friends did the typical movie thing and brought some of his dad's Playboy magazines from home. We were supposed to be there for 4 days. I only lasted 2. Anyway, it was late at night because I stayed up to do the trash duty and clean the mess hall. After I picked up the final granola bar wrapper, I made my way to the showers to clean up before turning in for the night. Halfway through, I hear a loud shuffling sound outside the showers. Now, I assume it's my friends pranking me as they typically did and got out of the shower. Now, just to put this into perspective, the showers and the boys' cabins are a good walk away with no way to illuminate your surroundings. That's why they shower before dark and in groups to make sure nobody gets lost. Now, for someone like me, who's by himself having to navigate his way through the woods, it's pretty fucking terrifying. And to make matters worse, the flashlight I brought was back at the cabin. So I was stuck having to navigate my way back with a piece of shit lantern that barely gave me enough light. So anyway, I grabbed the lantern and started to walk to the cabins. About halfway through, I heard this ungodly moan coming right in front of me. I panicked and dropped the lantern, running in the opposite direction of the sound. And not seeing anything in my haste, I fell on something. I examined the thing that I fell on and realized it was squishy and soaking wet. I heard the moaning again from behind me and hauled ass to the direction of the cabins. I was instantly greeted by 3 flashlights and lots of concerned looks. Apparently, the other campers heard the moans and the counselors came to investigate, only to find me covered in head to toe in fucking blood. They brought me back to the cabins and I was immediately bombarded with questions about what I saw. Frustrated by the machine gun of questions, my friends shut them up. The next day, I went home. And who the hell would blame me? I was not going to stay there after the shit I'd been through. You know, it may sound strange, but the truth is, I almost forgot about this incident until a little while ago when I was reminiscing about summer camp with a friend of mine who also stayed at the camp. I asked him what happened after I left, and what he told me sent shivers up my spine. Apparently, after I left, the moans at night got louder and closer to the cabins and freaked everybody the hell out. And as for that big thing that I fell on, while the counselors were investigating the source of the moaning, they found a deer on the trail I was on. The head was ripped clean off, and its entrails were laying in a separate pile next to the carcass. That's my encounter. To this day, it remains the scariest experience I've ever had. Everyone that I've told thinks that I'm bullshitting, but my friends who were there always defend me. Now, I still don't know what the hell it was in the woods that night. Over the years, a few people have tried to tell me that the moaning sound I heard was a mountain lion, but I have my doubts. The moan sounded too high to come from a mountain lion. But my girlfriend had another idea. She thought that the thing I saw was a creature called the Wampus Cat, which is apparently a mythological half-woman, half-cat monster that stalks the woods of East Tennessee. And it was a creature that was and is known among the Cherokee. The bottom line is, when I was a boy, enjoying the thrills and fun of summer camp, I had an encounter with a real-life monster. This is my first time going public about my dogman encounter, mostly out of fear of seeing it again. This took place roughly 14 years ago. When I was a kid, my family moved out of the city and moved to a small town called Deer Brook, situated on the outskirts of Antigua, Wisconsin. Our house was surrounded by woods on 3 sides and a river and field in the back. The first year out there was really calm and relaxing, other than constant coyote howls every night. But every so often there would be a different howl. It was a deeper, much louder howl that would shake us to our core. At first, my parents would dismiss it as a wolf or just a bigger coyote, but something about it seemed off. One night in mid-July, my brother, my sister, and I decided to pitch a tent in the back field along the tree line. We just wanted to go camping. We sat with sticks, roasting our marshmallows by the fire till it got really dark. And then the typical howl started up. But once again, that deep howl was back, and it sounded like it was right in our ears. With how loud it was, it's hard to even guess where it was coming from, so we decided to put out the fire and get in the tent. Later that night, my sister fell asleep, so my brother and I chatted and just made jokes. Within minutes, we heard animals running around outside the tent. And then this little raccoon started to claw at the side of the tent that I was sleeping on. At first, I just kept poking at it, but then we heard something else. The crack of sticks from the trees. At that point, my brother thought it was a bear and told us to be quiet, and woke up my sister. We started to hear footsteps coming closer and closer, and pretty quickly, they were right next to me. Now the raccoon just bolted the hell out of there. And then there was this strange odor coming from somewhere, and it smelled like copper, sulfur, and a wet dog. It was almost overpowering and made me feel like I could throw up. Then we heard our mom calling us, and as she shined the flashlight on us, it revealed the most unsettling thing I've ever seen. The shadow of this thing was shining through our tent, and it was massive. It had pointed ears that were tilted back like a dog on the prowl, and its hands were human-looking with long fingers that ended in a point. The mouth was in the shape of a snout, just a little shorter, and it had a mid-sized tail. My mom started screaming, and whatever the thing was bolted back into the woods, and that's when I got a fairly good look at it. We tore ass inside the house with our mom and didn't go back out for a few days. Now fast forward a few months. I was in the living room with my mom while my sister was in the shower. We were watching Wheel of Fortune or some game show like that when my sister screamed, "Bloody murder." My mom jumped up and went to get her. She pulled her out of the bathroom, and I got curious as to why she was freaking out, so I went in to see. Above the shower is one of those super small windows that only a small head could fit through. And in the window was a set of red, glowing eyes staring down at me. Holy shit. We stared at each other for what seemed like a decade, even though it could only have been a few seconds. Now here's the weird thing. I didn't feel fear, but more like curiosity. And I didn't feel like I was in any danger at that time. And as my mom came in to get me out, the eyes turned away as well. Now that night was a kind of gloomy night. It wasn't very windy, but there was a light drizzle. Later during the night, my brother and I got woken up to the window being opened. It was locked beforehand, by the way. After that, we just closed it and went back to bed. It happened again and again, like 3 more times, and each time we locked it. But the final time was the worst. It flung open so hard that the glass shattered, and then we saw the thing that pushed it open. It was that same monstrous hand from the tent, but I could see it clearly now. It had matted black fur, or hair rather, covering its whole arm. The skin on its palms was like a light tan, and the claws were easily 5 to 6 inches long. And on the bottom of the window, I saw its face, or what was showing of it. It was just the eyes, glowing bright red again, looking like the embers of a roaring fire. My brother and I bolted up, grabbed my sister, and locked ourselves in the back gaming room. We stayed there for the rest of the night. That's when my mom came home. We told her and packed our things. We moved out of that house in a day and took what we could fit, filling 1 car and a U-Haul trailer. My stepdad's truck was full as well, and we left never to return. To this day, my family is scared to talk about it, but if my brother and I have a few drinks, we discuss it. But my mom, she just shuts down whenever it's brought up. You're listening to the Blackwater Media Radio Network, the finest in digital audio entertainment. This is Blackwater Media coming to you from the great city of Atlanta. I left home before sunrise on my way to spend the Thanksgiving holidays with my parents. Just 2 or 3 days of reminiscing, food, drinks, and of course, football. I'd gotten a good ways down the highway and turned onto Old Black Rock Road, which I knew would add an extra 20 minutes or so to the drive. But I couldn't resist the scenery of the farmland. The old barns, grazing horses and cattle. All of the things that registered in my memory bank of golden childhood memories. My dashboard clock read 7:20 a.m. But then, as I rounded the bend in the road, all of those hazy, fond boyhood remembrances crashed. Out ahead of my car, maybe 30 yards away and about 50 feet up in the air, was and I have to keep it real here, a UFO. I mean, this damn thing was just hovering there, a classic flying saucer, like in some Saturday afternoon science fiction movie. Silvery, metallic looking, disc-shaped, yellow, blue, and red lights rotating in a clockwise fashion. Now, I didn't get out of the car, but I let my window down and I could hear a very faint hum, very faint. Then it shot off, not straight up, but away from my position to the south, and disappeared over a hillside about half a mile away. My dashboard clock now read 8:30 a.m. What the fuck? The whole sighting couldn't have been more than 5 minutes. How the hell did I lose an hour and 10 minutes? I remember sitting there thinking to myself, God damn, I just saw a UFO, close up, clear as a bell, hovering right in front of me, and saw it fly off. It wasn't Venus. It wasn't a flock of geese or temperature inversion or any of that other silly dismissive bullshit. And oh yeah, it wasn't swamp gas. My family on my dad's side moved from Delaware to South Carolina in the 70s. They came through the state of Maryland on the way down. My dad and his brother were behind a good ways in another car, and it was late at night. There were no cars on the road, no houses, no nothing, just miles of road. Now keep in mind that this was in the 70s. That means no cell phones, no OnStar, no GPS. None of the things that make highway travel much easier nowadays. Back then, when you were traveling down an isolated highway, there were all kinds of things that could go wrong with no hope of help or assistance. To coin a phrase, it was a different time. Anyway, as they cruised down the highway, they came upon an old woman with an odd-looking dress on, walking down the side of the road. So, they started to slow down and noticed that she was very pale. It was strange. It was damn strange. At that point, they were starting to get some really, really bad vibes. Well, as they pulled up next to her, my dad, who was in the passenger seat, said, "Miss, do you need some help?" Now later on, he said that when she turned her head, she looked like something out of the movie The Exorcist. Her pale face was ghastly, and her eyes looked completely black. And worst of all, she made what sounded like a terrible hissing reptilian sound, which, as you might imagine, scared everybody 10 kinds of shitless. My uncle floored it, and he kept that car at around 90 to 100 miles per hour till they were out of Maryland. It's a miracle that there wasn't an accident, or that they weren't stopped by the police. My uncle won't talk about it, but my dad told me the whole story. There's some seriously weird shit in Maryland. Okay, so I have a story about a creepy encounter that my friends and I had. To set the scene, we were on a Boy Scout camping shooting trip. There were between 20 and 30 of us. We were in a small cabin with windows on the front and back, and a front and back door. There were wooden tables all around the area. The adult cabin, with the bathroom, was about 1/8 of a mile down a gravel road in the dark. Now, it was the Boy Scout, so there was obviously a buddy system. Now, at around midnight, everyone had been telling scary stories, like normal camping trips. Well, I had to go to the bathroom, and I asked my friend to come along. He said, sure. And we got our knives. We knew that there were bears in the woods, and it made us feel safer. Well, we went to the bathroom and started our walk back. That's when it got scary. I mean, shit scary. I felt an instinctive sense of fear. I looked at my friend, and he had the same look on his face. So we started to walk a little faster and also unfolded our pocket knives. I turned around, and I saw it. Now, this thing looked similar to a cat, but it was at least 6 feet tall and on its hind legs kind of hunched over. I freaked the fuck out and started running like you wouldn't believe. My friend saw it too, and we sprinted back to the cabin. The creature began making a moaning, howling noise, somewhere in between those two, and it followed us slowly. We pounded on the door, and the guys let us in. We told them what we saw, and they actually believed us. So we locked the front door and looked at the back door. It didn't have a lock. So we pushed the table up against it and had another friend stay there with his knife for safety. We drew the blinds on all the windows, although one of them didn't have blinds, and we sat there with all the lights on. Of course, we saw the eyes outside of the windows without blinds. To put it bluntly, we were all scared shitless. And this thing walked slowly to the back door. We heard this damn thing bumping up against the door, maybe trying to open it. Then, it just left. But we still thought that we were going to die. Nobody slept. When the adults came to wake us up, we told them and they just laughed and said we were making it up. We know what happened, even if they don't believe us. That's the sound that I hear almost nightly for weeks at a time, beginning in September, or more precisely, immediately after the advent of the fall equinox. I live about an hour and a half's drive north of a major city in the southeastern United States. In this particular area, you can find sizable stretches of woodlands, creeks, and even some relatively dense forests. This is the habitat of those things out there. Those creatures howling into the darkness of the autumn night sky. This past autumn, the fall of 2020, was no different. I heard the howls in the distance and listened as they seemed to come closer. This seemed to be their nightly routine, to emerge from the inner depths of the forest and prowl along its outer perimeter. I know because it got to the point where I could go out on my deck, which overlooks a wood line, and I could actually watch them step out of the woodland cover. There would typically be 4 or 5 of them, never less than 3, at least of what I could see. On nights with good moonlight, I could see them even better. They would move through the trees, going from 4 legs to 2, and then back again seemingly arbitrarily. When they did go bipedal, I got a true sense of their size and features. But it was always the eyes. Now, one could easily be struck by the 7 or 8 foot height, the clawed fingered hands, the impressive musculature, or even the surreal nature of their movement. But for me, it was the eyes, those massive, amber, nightmarish hell portals through which somehow these creatures measured their reality. There were even rare occasions when one of them would turn those eyes in my direction, looking directly at me, as if to let me know that they were aware of my presence, and then turned its gaze away dismissively and walked on. Their eyes terrified me. So yes, these things are out there, hunting, lurking, hiding, stalking. And I know that come September next, there will once again be howls in the forest. Hey everybody, this is Dr. William Lester, and I want to tell you about a new membership opportunity from Blackwater Media. Now yes, you can sign up for the regular Swamp Hunter Society membership at $4.99 a month and have access to the premium content. But you also have the option of getting the Blackwater Media VIP full year membership. That's right, with a one-time payment of just $49.99, you can have the same access to the same premium content, early releases, at a savings of almost $10 off of a regular membership. So if you enjoy the finest in paranormal and cryptid horror, head on over to blackwatermedia.net and get your Blackwater Media VIP full year membership. The experience I want to tell you about took place in Texas on June 20th, 2000, around 1 a.m. I just got off from work and was headed east. On this particular road, there's a 90-degree turn, and at times you have to watch out because cattle might be out in that road. That morning, that's what I thought had happened. No one else was on the road, but I saw red eyes that would look at the truck lights and look down and back up and look down over and over. So I quickly went from something's not right to what the fuck is going on here? Now keep in mind, I was on the left side of the road, and when I got close, I noticed that this red-eyed creature stood about 6.5 feet tall and had black hair all over its body. I stopped the truck, got out my spotlight, and shined it on the creature. It seemed like forever, but I know that it was only a few minutes. The creature raised its arm above its head and let out a terrible scream that I know I've heard before. It turned around, dashed away, and disappeared behind a house. I've heard that sound before when I lived in Orange, Texas, just a few miles from that location. Now, I've traveled this road many times hoping to see this creature again and never have. I've been told this creature is similar to the Sasquatch of the Pacific Northwest. In 2016, I was visiting some relatives in Maryland. Every so often I'd stop by and just relax with them. Where they live was somewhat suburban with forest land towards the back of their property. It was a fairly large wooded area, but I never really paid much attention to it. I said all that to give a picture of my surroundings on this particular night. It had to be between 11:30 and midnight. Anyway, we were talking when a strange feeling came over me, as though something bad was about to happen. I got up off the porch and began to scan the street. My cousins all the while talking, when I saw a creature that resembled a deer walk out onto the street. It was four-legged with way more muscle mass than any buck I ever seen. Its head was huge and fit its massive body. Height-wise, I'd say it was about 6.5 feet, maybe more. Its antlers were the strangest part to me, though. I mean, they were wide, way more so than I thought they should be. But they didn't really stick up like a regular deer. They curved and bent into 3 intricately grown stacks on top of each other. It was weird. It gave me the impression that it was some ancient beast that roamed the woods for hundreds of years. It was like this thing shouldn't even have existed. It didn't even have that timid, skittish walk like you see from most deer. It walked as though it was royalty and dared anyone to challenge it. It stopped in the middle of the street and just stared at me. So we both stood looking at each other for about 20 seconds or so. And it was as if it wanted me to know that it was there. Then, just as calm as it walked out, it turned and walked back to the direction it came. Now, of course, my cousins were too busy running their mouths to get off the porch and see it, so I'm the only one that got a good look at it. And when I tried to tell one of them, their drunk asses just said it was an old buck. Now, I'm by no means an outdoors man, but I've seen older bucks with gray hairs and huge antlers, and that thing was nothing like them. When I told an old coworker of mine from South America who's had encounters with the paranormal, she told me that the devil had decided to show himself to me that night. So that's my whole story from that night. I shared it because, in all honesty, I wish I knew what the hell that thing was. And hopefully, it wasn't the devil. But the way that year was for me, it might well have been. I had a very creepy experience on my way to work one morning. Now listen, I normally don't give much thought to anything paranormal, but I'll be damned if that thing I saw could be explained rationally. On my way to work, I often use a small road through a densely wooded area. It's a pretty long road, very few curves, no turns. I left home around 4:30 a.m. and was driving, paying attention to the road, trying to wake up, when I suddenly noticed what I thought was a very large, dark gray or black dog sitting next to the road. Now keep in mind, it was still dark, but I could make it out in full detail, so I slowed down, just in case it started to run across the road. But when I got closer, and the headlights captured it in full, it just stood up and calmly retreated into the bushes next to the road. But as soon as it stood up, it was very clear that this was no normal dog. I mean, it was fucking huge. A bear size at least, or even bigger, I'd say. It had shorter hind legs, muscular front, and a weirdly long snout, pointy ears, and a bushy tail. And it kind of walked almost like a hyena, but always on all fours. Now, big predators are very rare in this area, and if there is a sighting about every 2 years or so, it's usually a lone wolf, or very rarely, a bear wandering through. Something else. This stretch of road has always given me the creeps, but now the fear has a face. One thing I noticed the last few days was that there were no other animals around. Now, normally there are always some deer, some foxes, or if I get lucky, even a badger. But that week, nothing, not even a bird. There had also been some reports of missing livestock in the area, and this was disturbing. 2 sheep went missing the week before, and a few days ago, a horse was lost. It was later found, brutally ripped apart and partially eaten. Now, I can't swear that this unknown canine creature was responsible for this, but I highly suspect that it is. I'm originally from Michigan, around the Metro Detroit area. This is the story my aunt told me and my cousins a couple of years ago. When she and my uncle first moved to Michigan more than 20 years ago, they decided to take a weekend getaway along with another 2 friends to go sightseeing at a lake in northern Michigan. Now, she doesn't remember exactly how everything happened then, but told us that they encountered a pack of wolves and they had to retreat back into their car. What they noticed right off was that one of the wolves was exceptionally large like a cow. That's the way she put it. She said it had black fur and a very mean-looking face. And then, holy shit, this damn thing stood up on 2 legs, and it was a moment of sheer terror. Now, the other wolves remained on all 4s and moved to surround their car, growling and howling the whole time. It must have scared the shit out of all of them. At that moment, my uncle was like, "It's time for us to get the hell out of here before that one on 2 legs makes a move." He hit the gas, hauled ass down the road, and hit the main highway. This is a little story to keep in mind if you're ever near the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and the Isle Royale National Park. My name is Wilson. I currently live in a small town in Middle Georgia, and I want to let everybody know something. There's something weird in Harper's Pond down here. I know it because I've gone fishing there now for going on 10 years. You know, there's always stories, more like tall tales, local legends, and that kind of shit. I usually go along with it just for laughs and drinks. You know, the kind of yarns that the old women talk about while they're sitting out on the front porch peeling potatoes, or the shit talking that goes on with the old guys sitting around Hal's garage, or out front of the Little Rooster grocery store, smoking Lucky Strikes and Marlboros. Anyway, Harper's Pond is really a lake. It's a little too big to be called a pond, but anyway, that's the name. But a couple of months ago, right about when the hot weather came in, I was out there fishing for bluegill in my boat. It's nothing fancy, it's just a rowboat. I was about 3/4 out, close to the middle of the lake, but not totally. I saw something breaking the surface halfway between me and the bank. Whatever it was dark. Not black, but very dark. I could see at least 5 semi-triangular ridges protruding, and what looked to be a pointed tail. Although I couldn't see the entirety of whatever the hell this thing was, what I could see was at least as long as my 12-foot rowboat. I thought to myself, man, fuck this, and I paddled back to the dock and headed on down to Maury's for at least a double whiskey. Now, I can't tell you what that thing was. I can't tell you where it came from or how the hell it got into the lake. But I can tell you that by my reckoning, it's a monster. From now on, I'm steering clear of Harper's Pond. The Freedom Riders were civil rights activists who rode interstate buses in segregated southern states to challenge the non-enforcement of the Supreme Court rulings that segregated public buses were unconstitutional. In short, southern states ignored the court decisions in order to maintain segregation. My name is Richard, and I'm proud to have been among the hundreds of young people to participate in that effort. On December 10th, 1961, we left the Atlanta Terminal Station on a Trailways bus bound for Albany, 183 miles to the south. Now, trust me, there wasn't a lot to see on those long stretches of Georgia highway once we were out of Atlanta. But the bus was filled with laughter, conversation, and transistor radios radiating the sounds of Ray Charles and Jackie Wilson. Anyway, we stopped in Cordele, which was only a small smattering of buildings, houses, and farms along the highway. So by stopped, I mean the bus pulled into an abandoned lot, mostly overgrown with weeds, and the lot looked to have been a gas station at some point. It was a good opportunity for everyone to stretch their legs, enjoy sandwiches, coffee, Coca-Cola, and cigarettes. 15 minutes later, the bus driver, a guy named Mike, came barreling around the corner yelling for everyone to get back on the bus. My first thought was like, shit, did the Klan show up out here? Because I knew for a fact that there were some brothers out here packing some firepower under their jackets. But there was just a brief moment of confusion. And again, Mike, the driver, reiterated in a much louder voice, "Get on the goddamn bus." And that was it. Everybody loaded onto the bus, still eating, sipping coffee, and smoking. Strangely, there wasn't too much made about why we had to get back on so fast, and it didn't take long for all the music and laughter to kick back up again. I can say this now because so many years have gone by. But a few miles down the road, Mike, our driver, took a fairly deep swig from his flask, and we kept rolling. When we pulled into Albany, I went up to ask him about what shook him up so much. He just looked at me, hesitated for a moment, and said, "A damn huge-ass wolf ran across the road." And I was like, "What? Man, there aren't that many wolves in Georgia, and aren't they mostly up in the mountains anyway?" He said, No, you don't understand. This motherfucker was running on 2 legs, and it had to be 7 or 8 feet tall. Of course, like I said, that was a long time ago. I know now that what he saw was the thing people call Dog Man. Man, there's some crazy shit in this world. And based on what Mike said he saw, I'm glad it was him and not me.